Hi guys, how are you today? After a hard-working day, let's relax with this journey through history. Imagine the steady rhythm of the sea, gently rocking a ship on its vast, endless journey. The year is 1742, and you stand on the wooden deck, feeling the soft breeze on your face. Above, the sails flutter lazily in the wind, and below, the ship creaks with the movements of the waves. The world you know has shrunk to this small, enclosed space. This ship, which is both your home and your prison. Life at sea, during the 18th century, was a quiet kind of struggle. Far removed from the comforts we know today, sailors lived in conditions that were far from kind. They endured long days with little reprieve, surrounded by salt water and the constant hum of the waves. The days blurred together, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun, each one much like the last. In this journey, we will explore the simple yet difficult existence of the sailor. Their hardships were not dramatic or sudden, but instead a slow, consistent challenge, each day the same, and yet always different. Through this quiet exploration, we will glimpse the reality of life at sea, where endurance was often more important than survival itself. If you're as excited as we are to dive into this captivating journey, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss out on more adventures into the past. Let's uncover the mysteries of the 19th century together. Hit that bell icon too, so you're always first in line for the next historical adventure. Chapter 1. Life on board, a small and crowded world. Aboard the ship, space was a luxury few could afford. The wooden planks beneath your feet creaked softly, echoing the quiet, persistent rhythm of the sea. The air, thick with salt, mixed with the scent of wet wood and the faint musk of human presence. It was not a place designed for comfort, nor for solitude. The ship, small and narrow, was home to many sailors, each living and working in close quarters. Below deck, where most of the sailors spent their time, the atmosphere was heavy and close. There was little to distinguish one space from another. The cramped quarters were lined with hammocks that hung from the beams, swaying gently with the motion of the ship. These hammocks, strung close together, left little room for privacy. As you lay there, you would feel the gentle rocking of the ship beneath you, lulling you into a sense of stillness. The soft rustle of the fabric as the sailors shifted in their sleep was the only sound that broke the silence. The hammocks, though they offered some comfort, could never quite block out the reality of the crowded space. They were simple, functional, and often uncomfortable, but they were all the sailors had. The warmth of the bodies around you, the quiet murmur of voices, and the scent of the salt water that seemed to permeate everything, all of these things were a constant. There was no escape from the shared space, no opportunity for solitude. Each sailor was part of a community, yet always distant, alone in the crowd. As you lay in the hammock, the thick air around you grew warmer as the day wore on. The ship creaked again, a familiar sound that echoed through the space. It was not a sound of distress, but a quiet reminder that the ship, like its passengers, was in constant motion. The wood groaned as the ship shifted with the waves, and this rhythm became as much a part of your life as the movement of your body. There was a strange comfort in the creaking, a slow, predictable sound that anchored you to the present moment. The space below deck was far from ideal, but it was necessary. The ship, with its narrow hallways and low ceilings, offered little room for movement. Each sailor knew this well, and in time, the body adapted to the lack of space. There were no grand halls or rooms for privacy. The ship's design was simple, functional, and made for one purpose only, to stay afloat on the endless sea. The sailors, who spent most of their time below deck, were often engaged in simple, repetitive tasks. It was a life of routines, of small, quiet duties. There were no grand accomplishments to be made, no great feats to be achieved. Instead, life unfolded in the small, quiet moments, mending sails, cleaning the decks, securing the rigging. There was a calmness to this rhythm, a sense of steady purpose that guided the sailors through their long days. The work was not difficult, but it was constant, a never-ending cycle of small tasks that kept the ship moving forward. In the stillness of the ship, with the low hum of the sea surrounding you, the sense of time became distorted. Days blurred together. There was no clock to mark the hours, no calendar to remind you of the passing seasons. The rising and setting of the sun were the only markers of time. As the ship drifted further from the shore, the days became indistinguishable. There was a quiet, slow passage of time that could not be hurried. The sailors simply went about their work, each one moving through the motions of their daily lives, without the need for rush or urgency. Above deck, the world was no less crowded, but the vast expanse of the ocean was always in sight. Yet, even there, the sense of confinement was present. The ship was a world unto itself, surrounded by the endless water. There were no open skies, no distant horizons that promised freedom. Everything was contained within the ship's wooden frame. The sails, the rigging, the ropes, all of these things were part of a larger system that held the sailors in place. The ocean, though vast, was just as confining as the ship itself. There was little to distinguish one day from another. The weather, too, was predictable, as if each day passed in quiet repetition. The wind would blow at its usual pace, the sails would fill and flutter gently, and the sea would stretch endlessly into the distance. There was a soft, persistent rhythm to life on board, a rhythm that never faltered, no matter how far from shore the ship sailed. In this small, crowded world, the sailors lived in harmony with the ship. They had no choice but to adapt to their surroundings, to live in a space that was both cramped and necessary. The lack of privacy, the constant hum of the sea, and the simple, repetitive tasks became the backdrop of their lives. There were no great triumphs, no dramatic events. There was only the quiet, steady passage of time, a time that could not be rushed, a time that simply was. The sailors, too, were like the ship, carried by the steady rhythm of the sea, always moving, always working, but never in a hurry. The world of the ship was a small world, a world where each moment passed quietly, unnoticed, but steady. And in that quiet steadiness, there was a strange peace, a calm that could not be disturbed. Time, in this world, moved slowly, as if the sea itself was holding everything in its gentle grasp, allowing it to drift onward at its own pace. The sailor's life, small and quiet as it was, became a part of the larger rhythm of the sea. It was a world unto itself, where time was marked only by the soft creak of the ship and the slow, endless passage of the days. Chapter 2. The Hardships of the Sea. Constant exposure to the elements. The sea, as constant as the air itself, surrounded the ship in every direction. It was both a companion and a challenge, its presence unchanging and ever-present. Life on the water was shaped not only by the structure of the ship, but by the elements that governed everything: the wind, the sun, the rain, and the waves. These forces, though gentle at times, could also be unyielding, forming the backdrop of daily existence for the sailors. Beneath the soft, rhythmic creak of the ship, there was the constant whisper of the wind. It would shift and change, at times gentle and soothing, at others biting and cold. The wind would billow the sails, its force pushing the ship forward, guiding it along its path. There was no escape from it, as it moved in and out of the sails, causing the ship to sway ever so slightly. For many sailors, the wind became a part of them, just as much as the ship itself. It would fill the air with a soft, persistent hum, a reminder that the sea was always in motion, even when everything seemed still. On the warm days, the sun would cast its light across the deck, creating a bright reflection off the water. The ship would glow under its rays, and the sailors would feel the heat of the sun on their skin. The warmth could be comforting, but it could also become oppressive. The sun, relentless in its reach, would beat down for hours, its rays pressing heavily against the skin. There was no place to escape it. The open deck offered no shelter from its warmth. For those working on the ship, the heat became a constant companion, and the sweat would gather, drying quickly as the wind swept across the deck. The sun's heat was not the only challenge the sailors faced. The rain, too, would come, sometimes as a light drizzle, sometimes as a torrential downpour. The sky would darken, and the air would grow heavier with each passing minute. The rain, when it fell, did not care for comfort or ease. It would soak through clothes, turning them damp and heavy. There was no relief from the wetness, no shelter from its persistent touch. Even the warmth of the sun seemed to disappear, replaced by the cool embrace of the storm. And when the rain stopped, the air would be thick with moisture, leaving everything heavy and damp. And then there were the waves. On the calm days, the waves would glide gently beneath the ship, their rhythm so slow and steady that it was easy to forget their power. The ship would move with the ebb and flow of the sea, as though it, too, was caught in the gentle rhythm of the waves. Yet, even on the calmest days, the sea was never truly still. The waves would rise and fall, like the breath of the world itself. The ship would shift with the water, and the sailors would feel the gentle sway beneath their feet. It was as though the sea itself was alive, breathing softly beneath the ship, carrying it forward in its slow, steady motion. But the waves, though often gentle, could change in an instant. The sea, like the wind, could turn at any moment, shifting from calm to turbulent. On those rare occasions, when the waves grew high and the wind picked up, the ship would pitch and roll, sometimes violently. But these moments were brief, like storms that passed through the night. The sailors, though accustomed to the sea's temperament, would continue their work, adjusting their sails, tending to the rigging, and waiting for the calm to return. The waves, like everything else at sea, were always in motion. They were both a reminder of the power of nature and a gentle guide that kept the ship on course. The sea's ever-changing mood could be both soothing and exhausting. The gentle sway of the ship could lull the sailors into a peaceful rhythm, while the harsh winds and waves would test their endurance. But for the most part, life at sea was marked by a quiet patience. The sailors did not fight the elements. They worked with them, moving in tune with the ebb and flow of the water. There was no rushing the sea, and so there was no rushing in their lives. The days passed slowly, marked by the steady pull of the wind and the soft rocking of the ship. The sailors moved in a rhythm that mirrored the world around them, slow, deliberate, and unhurried. The rain, the sun, the wind, and the waves, these were the forces that shaped their world. The sailors learned to live with them, to adapt to their ever-changing nature. Each day brought a new version of the same quiet challenge. There were no guarantees, no promises of calm weather or smooth sailing. The sea could be both gentle and unforgiving, and life aboard the ship was shaped by this constant interplay. In the quiet moments, when the waves were still and the wind was gentle, there was a sense of peace in the simplicity of it all. The sea, vast and unyielding, would stretch out to the horizon, endless and timeless. It was a world without end, a place where time seemed to slow down, where each moment blended softly into the next. And the sailors, though bound by their work and the elements, would find comfort in this steady, unchanging rhythm. It was not a life of excitement, but one of quiet endurance, of moving with the flow of the world and finding peace in the slow, gentle passage of time. Chapter 3. The long, isolated months at sea. Out on the water, the days seemed to stretch into each other, blurring and blending until they became indistinguishable. There was no clock to mark the passage of time, no calendar to show when the seasons would change. Only the rising and setting of the sun and the soft motion of the ship provided any sense of time's quiet passage. Days turned to weeks, and weeks turned to months, each one marked by the same slow, steady rhythm of life aboard the ship. The world beyond the water seemed distant, almost forgotten, as if it belonged to another life, another reality. For the sailors, there was only the ship and the sea. The isolation was a constant, though it was never loudly felt. It was there in the silence of the deck as the ship moved across the water, in the quiet of the ship's hull as it groaned with the movement of the waves. The land, once so familiar, seemed farther and farther away with each passing day. The sailors saw it only in fleeting glimpses, small dots on the horizon that appeared and disappeared in the same breath. Even when the ship passed near to the shore, the land was but a brief moment in the vastness of the ocean, and after it disappeared, there was nothing left but the endless water. The silence of the sea wrapped itself around the sailors. They could hear nothing but the gentle rustling of the sails, the soft creaking of the ship, and the occasional voice of a fellow sailor. Most of the time, the men went about their tasks without speaking, their movements quiet and deliberate. The work was simple, repetitive, and necessary, but it did not demand much of their attention. The rest of the time, when the ship was calm, when the work was done, there was nothing to occupy the mind but the vast, open water and the distant horizon. There was no escape from the isolation. A sailor could not walk away from the ship, could not find shelter beyond the sea. The ship was their world, the place where they ate, slept, and worked. There was little room for personal space, little room for retreat. The crew lived together, their lives intertwined in ways that felt both intimate and distant. The close quarters, the shared tasks, the long hours. All of these things created a bond, but it was a quiet bond, formed not through conversation or companionship, but through the simple act of existing together in the same space. The isolation did not have the sharpness of loneliness. It was a soft, constant presence, like the gentle sway of the ship itself. The sailors did not long for company in the way one might in a crowded room. There were no crowds here. The sea and the ship were enough, and in their own way they became familiar. There were the same faces every day, the same routines, the same tasks to be done. Over time, the sailors would come to accept this rhythm, the repetition of it, the stillness. It became a part of their lives, as natural as breathing. The hours seemed endless, but they passed without much notice. When the work was done, the sailors would gather in the quiet of the evening. There were no songs or loud laughter, only the soft murmur of voices, the occasional sharing of a simple meal, the quiet exchange of words between men who had come to understand one another without needing to speak. Even in the stillness, there was a comfort. The ship moved gently through the water, the sea holding it in its steady embrace, and the sailors, though they were far from home, far from everything familiar, would find a kind of peace in this quiet, drifting existence. In the evenings, when the sun began to set and the sky shifted into shades of pink and orange, there was a moment of calm. The work for the day was done, and the night would come slowly, the stars beginning to appear one by one in the clear sky. The ship would continue its journey, but for a moment there was stillness. The world would seem vast and empty, and yet, in that emptiness, there was a strange peace. The sailors would watch the sky in silence, knowing that tomorrow would be much the same as today, and yet, somehow, different. The weeks stretched on, each day following the next, with the same quiet predictability. There were no celebrations, no holidays to mark the passage of time. Each sailor went about his work, lived his days, and passed the hours as best he could. In the rare moments when they could speak of home, of their lives before the ship, the sailors would share small stories, quiet memories of family, of friends, of places far from the sea. These memories, distant as they were, became part of the rhythm of their days, gentle reminders of another life, another world. And yet, even as the isolation of the sea continued, there was a sense of continuity, a sense that time, though slow, was still moving. The ship continued its journey, the sails billowed, and the sailors, though isolated from the world, found a quiet connection with one another and with the endless ocean that surrounded them. The months stretched ahead, each one filled with the same gentle passage of time, each one blending into the next, until the distant land appeared once again on the horizon, and the sailors would see, perhaps for the first time in months, the familiar sight of a shore. But until then, there was nothing but the ship, the sea, and the steady, unhurried rhythm of life on board. Time passed as it always did, slowly and steadily, without urgency or hurry. And the sailors, though far from home, would continue their journey in silence, moving with the flow of the sea, finding peace in the slow, gentle passage of time. Chapter 5. The Discipline and Authority. Fear of the Captain. The life aboard the ship, though marked by the slow passage of time and the constant sway of the sea, was not without its order. Beneath the soft creaking of the ship and the rhythmic sound of the waves, there was a quiet structure that governed every action, every movement. This structure, though unspoken in its steadiness, was enforced with a quiet authority that was as constant as the sea itself.
At the helm of this order was the captain. The captain, though seldom seen in the day-to-day life of the sailors, was a figure whose presence was always felt. His authority, though gentle in its application, was absolute. He was the guiding force that ensured the ship stayed on course, that the crew remained in line, and that the work was done. But his role, though important, was also distant. The captain rarely mingled with the crew. His orders came from above, carried down through the chain of command, and were obeyed without question. There was something about the captain that made him different from the rest. He was a figure apart, standing above the ordinary sailors. His decisions were final, and his word was law. But this quiet authority, though unwavering, did not need to be loudly declared. It was understood in the way the crew worked, in the way they moved, in the way they obeyed without hesitation. The sailors lived with this structure every day. They did not question the captain's orders, for to do so would have disrupted the delicate balance of the ship's life. The captain, though far removed from the practical tasks of the ship, was the one who ensured that everything continued smoothly. His authority was not the result of fear, but of respect for his role, respect for the system, and respect for the necessity of maintaining order in such a confined space. Discipline on the ship was a quiet thing. It was not enforced through loud commands or forceful actions. It was simply there, like the steady rhythm of the waves, always present, always understood. The sailors knew their roles, and they followed them with quiet precision. They did not need to be reminded of their duties, for the structure of the ship, the unspoken rules that governed life at sea, was enough to guide them. But there were times, quiet times, when the authority of the captain was felt more keenly. These moments were rare, and when they came, they passed without fanfare. If a sailor faltered in his work, if he did not meet the expectations set before him, there would be no harsh words or raised voices. Instead, there would be a soft reprimand, a quiet correction that would set things right once again. The captain's presence was felt, not in his actions, but in the way the crew responded. There was no need for the captain to raise his voice or make demands. His authority was something the crew understood without words, something that guided their movements even when he was not near. The fear of the captain, if it could be called fear, was not the kind that came with threats or punishment. It was the quiet understanding that the captain's word was final, that his decisions were made for the good of the ship and its crew. To defy him was to risk the stability of the entire ship, and so the sailors worked quietly, steadily, always mindful of the captain's expectations, always aware that their actions reflected not only on themselves, but on the ship as a whole. There was, in this quiet discipline, a sense of security. The sailors knew their place, and they trusted that the captain's leadership would keep the ship steady, that his decisions would keep them on course. The captain, though distant and rarely seen, was the anchor that held the ship in place, just as the steady rhythm of the sea held the ship in motion. And yet, the captain's presence was not always felt in the same way. There were times when the ship sailed smoothly, when the work was done with little trouble, and the captain's authority seemed to drift away, as quiet and unnoticed as the wind. In these moments, the sailors could go about their work without thinking of the captain, without the weight of his gaze upon them. The ship, it seemed, was enough to guide them, and the discipline of the ship's life was enough to keep things in order. But when the ship faced difficulties, when the winds turned harsh or the sea grew restless, the captain's authority returned, quiet and steady. His presence was not felt through words or commands, but in the way the crew responded, in the way they worked together to keep the ship steady, to follow the orders that came from above. The captain's authority was a constant force, not because it was demanded, but because it was understood. The discipline aboard the ship was not a harsh thing. It did not require loud voices or sharp rebukes. It was gentle, quiet, and unyielding, like the sea itself. The sailors knew their place, and they understood the importance of their work. They moved together in a rhythm, guided by the steady hand of the captain, and they found peace in the quiet order that shaped their days. In the end, the captain's authority, like the ship itself, became a part of the sailors' world. It was a constant, a foundation upon which everything else was built. And in the quiet discipline of their work, the sailors found a kind of peace that came from knowing that, no matter how far they sailed, no matter how long the journey, the captain's authority would guide them steadily onward. Chapter 6. The companionship and camaraderie. Bonds forged in adversity as the ship glided through the endless expanse of the sea. There was one constant that remained a quiet, shared experience among the crew. The sailors, though each with their own thoughts and histories, were bound together in a way that could only exist in the isolation of the ocean. The soft murmur of voices, the gentle shuffle of feet across the deck, the shared tasks, all these small, unspoken moments wove a quiet bond between the men. They were, in their own way, a community, each living in the same slow rhythm, surrounded by nothing but the vast, unbroken horizon. In this world, where land was but a distant memory and the sea stretched in all directions, there was a comfort in the familiarity of the crew. Though the ship was often crowded, the sailors learned to move together, to work as one. The tasks were simple, repetitive, yet necessary. Whether it was mending a sail, cleaning the deck, or tending to the rigging, these small chores became more than just work. They were opportunities for connection. With each task, there was a subtle sharing of responsibility, a gentle cooperation that did not need words. Each sailor knew what was expected, knew his part, and in doing so, became part of something larger, part of the ship, part of the journey, part of the crew. There were moments when the work would pause, when the rhythm of the ship would slow, and in those quiet times, the sailors would find a subtle sense of companionship. It was not the loud, boisterous companionship that one might find in a busy port or tavern. No, it was quieter, softer, a shared glance, a nod of understanding, a brief exchange of words. All these simple moments wove the men together. They were together, always, in the silence of the sea, in the slow, steady passage of time. There was something profoundly comforting in this unspoken companionship, a bond that was not formed by words, but by the shared experience of life on the ship. When the sun dipped below the horizon and the day's work was done, the crew would gather, not for grand celebrations, but for quiet moments of rest. The decks would fall silent, save for the occasional murmur of conversation. There were no great tales told, no raucous laughter. Instead, the men would share small stories, often of home, of family, of distant places they had left behind. In these moments, the sea felt less vast, less isolating, as the sailors found comfort in one another's voices. They would speak of the land they had once known, but now only remembered. Their words, though few, were a thread that connected them to a world far beyond the ship's wooden walls. And yet, despite the distance between them and the land they had left behind, the sailors had their own way of forming bonds. These bonds were not born of shared leisure or common interests, but of necessity, of the quiet understanding that life at sea demanded something more from them. It demanded patience, endurance, and a kind of quiet strength that could not be found on land. It was in the shared hardships that the true companionship flourished. The long hours of work, the isolation, the constant motion of the ship, all of these things brought the crew closer, not through grand gestures, but through the quiet, consistent act of being together, of enduring together. In the absence of family, of friends, of any familiar presence, the sailors became each other's family. They did not need to speak constantly to share their lives. The long stretches of silence between conversations were just as meaningful as the words themselves. The small, everyday moments of connection, the passing of a simple meal, the sharing of a brief laugh, were enough to create a deep, unspoken understanding between them. They were, in a sense, a family formed not by blood, but by shared experience. There was a subtle strength in this companionship, a quiet resilience that could only exist in the slow, unhurried rhythm of life at sea. The sailors did not need to express their emotions loudly. Their bond was forged in the small moments, in the simple tasks, in the long hours of work, and the even longer hours of waiting. It was in the way they worked together, side by side, without words, without hurry, that their connection grew. Each sailor played his part, and together they kept the ship moving forward. In the evenings, as the stars began to appear in the sky, and the day's work slowly faded into memory, the sailors would find solace in their shared presence. There were no expectations, no demands. The ship would continue its slow journey through the vast, dark ocean. But for that moment, the sailors were united in their stillness. There was peace in this quiet unity, a sense that, despite the isolation, they were not alone. The sea was vast, the journey long, but in the companionship of the crew, there was a small, steady comfort. It was a quiet camaraderie, one that did not require grand gestures or loud expressions of affection. The sailors understood each other in a way that could not be put into words. They had no choice but to be together, to rely on each other, to share in the simplicity of life at sea. And in that shared experience, they found something greater than friendship. They found a connection that transcended words, a bond forged in the stillness of the sea, in the quiet passage of time. In the end, it was not the grand moments of joy or the great feats of strength that defined their relationships, but the small, subtle acts of companionship that wove the sailors together. And though the sea remained vast, and the journey endless, they found comfort in the quiet, unspoken bond they shared. Together, they endured. Together, they sailed. And in that togetherness, there was a quiet peace that carried them through the long, silent months. Thank you for joining us. Rest well. Take care of your beautiful self, whatever that means to you, and until next time, good night.